Sometimes the loneliest people are the ones with the largest hearts. And sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he doesn't want to live alone anymore. Montana, 1887. The winter wind swept across the snow-covered hills, cutting through weathered wooden fences and carrying the dry scent of hay and wood smoke. Far off the mountains stood in their white silence, towering like ancient giants watching over the endless prairie. This was a land of extremes where winter could swallow a man whole in a single night, and summer could scorch the grasslands into dust in a matter of hours. In the small town of Redfern Ridge, most folks were farmers hunters, or the last stubborn gold seekers clinging to dreams left over from a rush a decade past. Here everyone thought they knew everyone else's business, at least that's what they liked to believe. And among all the names whispered over whiskey at the saloon, none stirred as much talk as Boon Cutter. Some swore he was a rough, dangerous giant, a man you didn't cross if you valued your teeth. One tale claimed he'd killed a grizzly bear with nothing but his bare hands. Another insisted he'd flattened 3 cowhands in a single night over a single insult. The truth. Well, few could say for certain, but they all agreed on one thing: Boon Cutter was not a man to trifle with. Yet behind that looming frame and shoulders like barn doors was a man who had lived alone for far too long. Boon managed the sprawling Triple C ranch, hundreds of acres of open-range cattle by the hundreds fences that always needed mending hay to stack, and horses as big and stubborn as he was. Each day was full of labor, but when the evening came and the fire in the hearth burned low, silence closed in around him, like a noose. Perhaps that's why one icy winter morning, Boon did something that made the entire town stop in their tracks. He posted a notice on the board outside the general store. The message was short, plain, and without frills seeking a wife. Promise of peaceful companionship. It didn't take long for the notice to become the talk of Redfern Ridge. At the saloon, men grinned into their whiskey-placing bets on which poor, unfortunate soul would be foolish enough to step into the Triple C. At the dressmaker's shop, women whispered that no sane lady would tie herself to a man as big as a bear and cold as the snow he rides through. Boon heard every word, but he didn't answer. He hadn't written that notice for their amusement. He had written it because this winter felt colder than the last, and the house he'd built with his own hands felt too empty. He wanted another voice besides the wind, another shadow on the wall besides his own. Boon wasn't chasing some wild notion of love at first sight. He didn't expect moonlight promises or sweet-talking courtship. What he wanted was a partner to share the quiet work of living. Someone who could rise with him before dawn, put coffee on the stove, ride the fence line beside him, and in the evening sit by the fire reading a book, or sharing the kind of silence that felt warm instead of lonely. A companion. Nothing more, nothing less. But life in Montana had a way of turning even the simplest hopes into unpredictable trails, because sometimes what you're looking for comes from a place you never expected, bringing with it both the light you didn't know you needed and the shadows you thought you'd left behind. If Boon Cutter was a great slab of stone standing unshaken against the storm, Clara Lin Porter was a small but steady flame burning quietly in the corner. Orphaned at 16 when a flu epidemic swept through Billings, Clara survived thanks to the kindness of Henrik Jorgensen, a warm-hearted Norwegian baker. He gave her not only a roof over her head, but also a trade, teaching her how to knead dough, how to keep a wood stove's heat through the night, and how to meet the dawn with bread ready for the town. 7 years later, Clara had become the backbone of Jorgensen's oven. She was used to waking before the sun, her hands deep in dough while the sky was still dark purple, and greeting the first customers of the day with a quiet smile. Outwardly, she appeared calm, neat, and unfailingly polite. But inside she knew she was slowly being walled in by routine. Every day was the same flour yeast, the smell of fresh loaves, and the silence after the shop closed. Sometimes alone in her attic room, she wondered if her life would have been different had she chosen another path. One winter morning, while delivering bread, Clara noticed a small crowd gathered near the general store's notice board. A few women stood in a cluster, reading aloud and giggling. When she stepped closer, she saw it a sheet of paper that stood out against the tattered old postings. The handwriting was large and firm. Seeking a wife. In return, peaceful companionship. The name at the bottom was instantly familiar, Boon Cutter. Who in Montana didn't know that name? The giant cowboy, the quiet man with eyes like steel. She had heard the half-true, half-wild tales about him, but unlike the others, she didn't laugh. She just stood there, staring at the words. There was something in that phrase, peaceful companionship, that caught her. It didn't promise riches. It didn't shout of passion or romance. It was honest. That day, as she wiped the counters and stacked trays in the bakery, her thoughts kept drifting back to that paper. She thought about the long winter nights when snow piled against the windows and the fire burned low. She thought about a cabin far from town where silence wasn't empty. It was shared. That night, she sat at her small desk, laid a blank page in front of her, and picked up a pen. Her hand trembled just a little. She kept it simple as Boon had. She wrote her name, her work as a baker, and that she was willing to meet and talk. No promises, no binding words. Just an answer. The next morning, when Clara handed the envelope to the delivery rider bound for the C Ranch, she had no idea that decision would change the course of her life forever. Boon Cutter didn't often get visitors at the C Ranch, especially in the dead of winter. But that morning, as he was repairing the doorframe of the horse barn, the steady rhythm of approaching hoofbeats carried clearly through the cold air. He looked up to see a small wagon rolling down the long track toward the gate. Driving it was Pete Hutchinson, the young man who hauled freight and mail for the town. Beside him sat a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, a gray wool scarf wrapped snugly around her shoulders, holding a cloth bag close to her lap. The wagon stopped in the yard. Pete jumped down first, throwing Boon a quick glance, half cautious, half curious, before turning to the woman. "This here's Boon Cutter, ma'am." The woman pulled off her scarf, revealing a bright face, deep black eyes, and a fine, straight nose. A few strands of glossy black hair had slipped loose from her neat bun. She stood with her back straight, though Boon noticed her hand still tightened slightly on the bag's strap. "I'm Clara Lin Porter," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I've come in response to your notice." For a moment, Boon simply looked at her, saying nothing. He hadn't truly expected anyone to show up, let alone a small, neatly dressed woman in a plain but spotless gown. "Come in," he said at last, his deep voice clipped and short. He led her into the broad but plainly furnished log house. Inside were only a few pieces of furniture, a dining table, wooden chairs, a bookshelf with a handful of worn volumes and a fire crackling in the hearth. Clara set her bag down, glanced around, then smiled faintly. "It's quiet here." "I like quiet," Boon replied. They sat facing each other. Boon wasn't a man for idle talk, so he went straight to it. "Why did you answer the notice?" Clara lowered her head slightly, her fingers tracing the bag's strap. "Because I think maybe we're looking for the same thing. Not exactly love, but a shared home." Boon studied her, and his gaze softened a fraction. He didn't see the curiosity of a gossip seeker in her eyes, but the measured thought of someone who meant what she said. Still, his tone stayed firm. "Life here isn't easy. Winters are cold. Work's heavy." Clara nodded. "I'm used to early hours and hard work. I'm a baker." Something in Boon's eyes shifted just slightly. The corner of his mouth lifted not quite a smile, but not cold anymore either. He nodded, filing that fact away. Their talk lasted less than an hour, but when Pete returned to take Clara back, Boon opened the door for her with a look different from the one he'd had when she arrived. He didn't know the name for that feeling, only that the sight of the small woman standing straight against the white winter yard had carved itself into his mind. In the days after their first meeting, Boon Cutter thought the matter would fade quickly, just another polite exchange, like the ones he sometimes had in town. But then Clara Lin Porter came back, and this time her arrival was no passing surprise. It became something he found himself looking forward to. The second time she came, the snow lay deeper, swallowing the last tufts of autumn grass and piling against the weathered fences. The road to the C Ranch was marked with crisp, frozen hoofprints. Boon was stacking bundles of hay onto the sled for storage when from a distance he heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats cutting through the sharp winter air. A sturdy brown mare appeared at the gate, her mane catching what little light the morning gave. In the saddle sat Clara, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, a thin sheen of frost on her scarf. She dismounted, unhooked a basket from the saddle, and said in her clear but gentle voice, "I brought you some bread." She set the basket on the porch table. Warmth still clung to it, carrying the scent of spiced loaves and honey bread. Boon lifted the cloth and saw the neatly wrapped loaves inside. He wasn't used to receiving gifts, and wasn't much for words, so he only gave a short nod. But Clara noticed just barely that the corner of his mouth had twitched upward for a fleeting moment. After that, she came more often. Some days she brought bread or jars of apple preserves. Other days, she simply stopped by to help with some small task. One morning, she accompanied him to the northern fence line where snow came up to their knees. The wind cut like a knife, but she didn't complain, just worked quietly beside him. At first, Boon kept his distance. He was used to silence, and to him silence had never been uncomfortable. But with Clara, the silence felt different. Not a wall, but a warm quilt. She didn't pry into his private life, didn't try to coax a laugh from him, and didn't seem at all unsettled by the lack of chatter. One rare afternoon, when the sun broke through, Boon and Clara rode across the pasture. The snow reflected the golden light, making the land glow as if lit from within. Clara rode beside him, the wind catching strands of her black hair, so they glinted with copper in the light. Without thinking, Boon slowed and looked at her longer than was necessary. "What is it?" Clara asked, glancing at him with curious eyes. "Just, you look like you belong here," Boon said, his deep voice slow but without hesitation. Clara smiled a small smile, but one that warmed the air between them. They kept riding, the sound of their horses' hooves mixing with the winter wind. In the days that followed, Clara began to weave visits to the Triple C into her routine, as naturally as kneading dough. Sometimes she fed the horses with him. Other times she joined him in hauling firewood for the stove. One day, when heavy snow had blanketed the ranch, Clara arrived carrying a newly knitted scarf. She held it out to him, saying the gray blue would match his eyes. Boon took it without a word, but that night, sitting alone by the hearth, he felt something unusual, a presence that lingered long after its owner had gone. For Boon, each of Clara's visits was like placing another small piece of trust into his hands. Not loud, not dramatic, but certain. He began to understand that the peaceful companionship he had written on that notice wasn't just a vague wish. It was taking shape day by day in the nods they exchanged, in the steps they took side by side, and in the silences that didn't need to be filled. That winter dragged on longer than usual. Cold northern winds swept down from the mountains, carrying with them sharp air and heavy snow. Boon Cutter was used to the cold, but he realized he had begun to look forward to Clara's visits the way a man looks forward to the glow of a fire on a dark night. That day, the sky was heavy with gray clouds, thick enough to promise more snow before nightfall. Boon was in the barn, brushing the thick winter coat of midnight, when the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly through the still air. He looked up to see Clara riding her sturdy brown mare, wearing a wool cloak, and around her neck the gray-blue scarf she had knitted for him the last time she came. "Busy?" she asked as she dismounted, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Not so busy," Boon replied, stepping to open the barn door. "Coming out here in this weather? Roads can't be easy." Clara smiled faintly. "I brought you bread and some preserves. But really, I wanted to ask you something." They went inside, and Boon added more wood to the fire. The flames flared, throwing warm light across Clara's face. She set her basket down, pulled out a small embroidered handkerchief, and placed it beside the teacup Boon had just poured for her. "Boon," she said softly, "but directly folks in town say a lot of things about you. But I want to hear it from you. Why have you lived alone all these years?" Boon sat silent for a moment, eyes fixed on the steaming tea in front of him. He wasn't a man who shared personal matters easily, but there was something in Clara's gaze, steady without being intrusive, that made him feel safe. "I used to have family," Boon began, his voice low and deliberate. "My parents died young. My brother and I rebuilt this ranch from nothing, but one winter sickness came through. I made it. He didn't." Clara's hands folded together in her lap, her eyes not leaving his. Boon went on. After that, I just worked, sunrise to dark, year after year, talking to cattle and listening to the wind. For a long time I thought I didn't need anyone. But then, he paused, eyes drifting toward the fire, I realized the silence wasn't the same anymore. It turned into a hole, and I started to fear that one day, no one would remember I'd ever been here. Clara drew a deep breath, as if holding something back. I know that feeling, she said quietly. After my parents died, I thought I'd live alone the rest of my life. But Mr. Jorgensen showed me that sometimes we don't need to find people just like us. We need to find the ones who make us feel like we still belong to the world. They sat in silence for a long moment, but it wasn't an empty silence. Boon felt as if an invisible thread had been strung between them, pulling them closer by the inch. At last, Boon turned to her, and for the first time his eyes carried a trace of hesitation. I'm not good with fancy words, but if you'd like, you could come here more often, not just to bring bread. Clara smiled a small, gentle smile, but enough to warm the whole room. I think I'd like that. Outside snow had begun to fall again, but inside the log house the fire kept burning, and Boon Cutter knew that the wall of ice around his heart had just cracked, letting in its first thread of warmth. Winter was slowly giving way, the snow retreating in patches to reveal damp, dark earth beneath. Water trickled down from the hillsides, forming narrow streams that wound their way through grass, still patched with ice. Boon Cutter and Clara had settled into a quiet rhythm, together few words, but an unspoken understanding in every movement. One early March morning, Clara was helping Boon split firewood in the yard when a lone figure appeared at the far end of the road. At first it was just a dark speck against the gray sky, but as it drew closer, the shape became clear, a tall man in a long brown coat, riding a black horse. Boon narrowed his eyes. The man's seat in the saddle, the way he handled the reins, too familiar to mistake. Thomas Garrett. Boon muttered, his voice low and heavy as stone. Clara looked up. You know him, I do, Boon replied, setting the axe down, his hands tightening into fists. We used to work together, and we nearly killed each other. Thomas Garrett reined in at the gate, his cold gray eyes sweeping over the yard before settling on Clara. He smiled, but it never touched his eyes. It's been a long time, Boon Cutter. Heard you've been busy, looking for a wife. Boon didn't answer. He stepped forward, stopping just far enough to block Thomas from entering the yard. What are you doing here? Thomas jerked his chin toward Clara. Just paying my respects, and reminding you that old debts aren't settled. Clara stood still, but her gaze sharpened. She could feel the tension between the two men, like a wire stretched tight, ready to snap. After a few more veiled remarks, Thomas turned his horse to leave, but before he went, he called back over his shoulder, I'll be back, and next time, it won't be for a chat. Boon watched him go, his face darkening. Clara stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. What's this about? Boon exhaled slowly, his broad shoulders sinking slightly. Years ago, we worked security for a merchant caravan. When we were attacked by bandits, Thomas abandoned everyone to save his own hide. I can't forget that. Afterward, he blamed me to the caravan owner. From that day, there was nothing between us but bad blood. Clara listened without interrupting, then asked quietly, Do you think he came here because of you? Or because of me? Boon didn't answer right away. But deep down, he knew. With Thomas, the surest way to strike was to go after whatever a man valued most. And now Clara was the most precious thing Boon had. That night, Boon checked over his rifle, made sure the locks on the barn and the house were strong. He didn't speak the thought aloud, but Clara understood this danger was no longer just a shadow from the past. It was here. 4 days after Thomas Garrett's appearance, the wind shifted hard. Heavy clouds gathered over the Montana sky, signaling that a snowstorm was on its way. Boon Cutter kept on with his daily work, but a steady vigilance lived behind his every movement. Clara sensed it too. She kept her revolver within reach while working in the kitchen, and made sure every window was locked at night. That afternoon, while Boon was feeding the horses in the barn, the sound of hoofbeats rolled in from a distance. They were different from the steady, familiar rhythm of a friend's visit. These were fast, urgent, and heavy. Minutes later, Thomas Garrett rode straight into the yard, flanked by 2 unfamiliar men. All 3 carried guns. Boon Cutter Thomas called out, his voice sharp with challenge. "It's time we settled." This Boon stepped out, rifle in hand, eyes cold and steady. "If you want to talk, leave your guns outside." Thomas smirked. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to take back what's mine." Clara stood at the doorway, her hand wrapped tightly around the grip of her Colt. "You don't have anything here, Garrett. Best you turn your horse around." One of the strangers started forward, closing in on Boon, but the sharp sound of a rifle bolt sliding home stopped him cold. Boon had raised his weapon, the barrel aimed square at the man's chest. "One more step and I pull the trigger." The air in the yard thickened. Wind hissed through the muddy, snow-patched ground. Thomas narrowed his eyes, then gestured for his men to hold back. "Fine, Boon. But this isn't over." As soon as they turned their horses and left, Boon looked to Clara. "They'll be back, and next time it may not just be threats." That night, Boon saddled up and rode into town to see Marshal Donnelly, the aging but sharp-eyed lawman. After hearing the whole story, Donnelly nodded. "Garrett's been under watch for extortion and assault in 3 other counties. If he stirs up trouble here, we'll take him down. But to make it stick, you'll need witnesses and proof." Boon understood. The next day, he and Clara invited their neighbors, the Vances, over for supper, and made sure to recount the entire incident from the day before. Old Mr. Vance, a retired soldier, agreed to testify if needed. As predicted 3 days later, Thomas Garrett returned, this time more aggressive than before. But the moment he stepped into the yard, he was met by Marshal Donnelly and 2 deputies lying in wait. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the cold air. "Garrett, you're under arrest for armed threats and unlawful trespass," Donnelly declared firmly. Thomas fought against their grip, but it was no use. He shot Boon and Clara a glare full of hate, but he knew this time it was over. The trial in Redfern Ridge moved quickly. With the testimony of Clara Boone and the Vances, along with Garrett's criminal record from other counties, the court sentenced him to 7 years in prison. As the lawman escorted him away, Clara finally let out the breath she'd been holding, while Boone simply squeezed her hand, a quiet gesture that carried every ounce of relief and gratitude he felt. That afternoon, the sun broke through after days of gray skies. Boone and Clara sat together on the porch, watching the horses graze peacefully in the pasture. They didn't need to speak to know this victory wasn't just about the law. It was about trust, about protecting what mattered most, and about 2 people who had once lived in loneliness, now finding their place in each other. The following spring, Montana wore a new coat. Green fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with bright wildflowers. From the hillside overlooking Redfern Ridge, the wind carried the scent of fresh grass and the songs of meadowlarks. It was in this season that Boon Cutter and Clara Lin Porter decided to bind their lives together. The wedding was held in the small church at the end of Main Street. Townsfolk from the blacksmith to the bakery lady came to offer their blessings. Boone wore a white shirt and his old but well-kept brown coat, while Clara looked radiant in a simple cream-colored dress, a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. When the pastor spoke the vows, Boone held Clara's hands tightly, his gaze never leaving her face, as if carving that moment into his heart forever. After the wedding, they returned to Triple C Ranch, a place that would no longer be the home of 1, but the hearth of 2. The early days of their marriage were quiet and warm, feeding the horses together in the early mornings, working the fields, before the sun rose high, and sitting by the fire in the evenings sharing a pot of hot tea. The years rolled on. They weathered harsh winters, dry summers, and windy autumns. Clara brought Boone a warmth he'd never known, and Boone gave Clara a strong, steady shoulder she could lean on any time. In their 2nd year, they rebuilt the horse barn and expanded the west pasture. In the 3rd year, Clara planted a small apple orchard by the creek. That fall, the first apples ripened, and Boone built a long table in the yard so they could have breakfast surrounded by flowers and the sound of running water. By the 4th year, they adopted an orphaned boy from town. His name was Eli Brown, Curl's eyes bright as stars. Eli quickly became the joy of their lives, racing around the ranch, learning to ride with Boon and bake bread with Clara. In the 5th year, on a breezy spring morning, Boon stood by the fence watching Clara and Eli flying a kite in the pasture. The wind tossed Clara's black hair, and Eli's laughter rang clear. In that moment, Boon realized his life had truly entered a new chapter, not one of cold silence, but of family hope and the future. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains red, Boon turned to Clara. "If I hadn't posted that notice looking for a wife, I'd probably still be a lonely man." Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "Maybe, but sometimes it's not the notice that matters. It's that you opened your heart enough to let me in." Boon nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I want Eli to grow up knowing that life can take many things from us, but if we have the courage to open our hearts again, it can give back something even more precious." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence watching the sun dip lower. The clouds above shifted from gold to purple, promising a peaceful night ahead. The story of Boon Cutter and Clara Lin Porter spread through Redfern Ridge as a quiet testament to a simple truth: happiness is not found in grand promises, but built from small acts, shared moments, and the belief that even after loneliness, people can still find each other in this wide, wild world.